Hello, welcome back to my channel and to my BBC Shakespeare retrospective. And today we've reached two plays that I am absolutely fascinated by, and I think are at the centre of Shakespeare's work. Henry IV, Parts 1 and 2. They're part of a wider cycle from Richard II right through to Henry V, that period of British history when Richard II, a weak king, was deposed by Harry Bolingbroke, then his reign, and then the takeover by his son, who will become Henry V. Now, what's interesting here is the BBC production picks up on Richard II, which it did last season. It actually shows a brief flashback to it at the beginning. And John Finch retains the role of Henry IV, and thank God he does, because he's quite brilliant. He's a brilliant verse speaker, and I think his performance actually it deepens and widens, and he's really superb. And watching this production, I realised for the first time that Henry IV is actually quite a major role. Whenever I think of these two plays, I always think it's really about Hal and Falstaff, you know? But actually, this production, David Giles, actually centres as much on the politics and the tragedy of Henry IV as it does on what's happening with Hal and Falstaff. Not like, for example, Orson Welles in Chimes at Midnight, a film which I'm going to mention quite a lot, I think, in this video, because it has such a powerful impact on me, that film. I think it's such a beautiful film, for me, the greatest Shakespeare adaptation on screen. And I keep going back to that version in my mind. But that version is very Wellesian. It's very Orson Welles' idea of the play, and it's not the play as Shakespeare wrote it. This production is more closer to the play that Shakespeare wrote. And it's really, Henry IV is not an incidental character. He's the key figure here. But you see, what is Shakespeare doing here? This was a key period in British history. A king was deposed, usurped. That's an awful moment in any monarchy. And so, in the scheme of it, Henry IV's reign cannot be seen as good. It's clear that Shakespeare admired Henry IV, admired Bolingbroke, admired his courage, his determination, his gentlemanliness, his power and strength. But he must be sort of punished, if not symbolically. Not, he will become a decent king, but he will always be fighting rebellion. There'll always be this idea of the body politic. The body is diseased because the king has won it in the wrong way. And the only way that this can be put right, and this comes through in the text, is that the son takes over legitimately, and then he can become the good king. And of course, we'll see in Henry V, Henry V is probably the ideal king, according to Shakespeare. But we've got to go through this transition period. And the king, Henry IV, literally becomes ill throughout this production, even though I think John Finch is quite brilliant and shows that he was a much underrated actor, great Shakespearean, should have been a better star. The director has this thing where he's got these itching hands, he's got something wrong with his skin, and John Finch keeps fiddling with his gloves, which gets a bit irritating, actually. And later on, poor old John Finch has to act with some Rice Krispies attached to his face to show that he's got some kind of, syphilis or skin disease or something. But John Finch manages to get through despite that. But it shows the tragedy of this man who's won this kingdom by means that could be seen as good or bad, depending on your perspective. But he cannot be allowed to enjoy it. Only his progeny can. And what I didn't realise until I saw this production is how beautifully moving that scene is at the end of part 2, where Henry IV and his son, there's that scene where it appears that Henry IV has died. And Henry V thinks he's dead and then contemplates, I've got to put this crown on my head. And then Henry IV wakes up. Actually, I'm not dead. It's a bit silly, really. But then, and he thinks his son has betrayed him. And then they have this chat at the end of the bed, the two of them together. One king passing it on to another. It's actually incredibly moving. And what I realised is that that's the true end of the play. I think that Orson Welles and other modern directors have made the end of the play Hal's rejection of Falstaff. That's the literal end of the play. But really the moment when Hal becomes king is that bedside chat. That's both the tragic but beautiful ending of Henry IV's story and the real start of Henry V. And I didn't realise that until this production. But okay, I know what you want to talk about. You want to talk about Falstaff. Let's get into it. Now, I think for most modern viewers of these plays, what we think of as the story of Falstaff is this. Hal, the king's son, he's messing around with thieves and cut purses and the denizens of the East End, right? And his father is furious about it. But what we as an audience intuit is this, that Hal has found a surrogate father. He and his father are sort of estranged. This is cold majesty of his father. And Falstaff is this rumbustious, red-faced, wine-drinking, whoring, fun kind of guy who Hal likes to hang around with and who he learns in the University of Life from, right? And then they do all these sort of silly adventures and everything. And all the time, Hal is learning, but he knows that at some point he's going to have to reject this man. There's a very cold, chilling soliloquy that Hal delivers in Henry IV Part 1, where he calculatedly thinks, look, if I'm seen to be bad throughout my youth and then suddenly I emerge as great, then I'll seem all the greater. It makes Hal a very unsympathetic figure. And then that speech is mirrored later on by Henry IV, his own father, who says, look, you know, you're a king. You shouldn't be seen too much by the public. They shouldn't know you. Otherwise, they won't respect you as much. So there's this calculation of being a king, how you are as a person and how that interacts with the professionalism of being a king conflict, and they're both seeing it in different ways. But what we see is that it's Falstaff and Hal is a kind of surrogate father-son relationship. And eventually Hal, because he has to become king, rejects Falstaff. And Falstaff's heart is broken. And he goes to Doll Tearsheet, and they have this sort of little moment together, and then he dies of a broken heart. Is that true? Is that what's in the text? Or is it because over the centuries, Falstaff has become such a popular character that he's been sentimentalised? And that actually what we respond to is a modernist reading of the film, of the play, where we are psychologising Falstaff, right? You see it in Laurence Olivier's Henry V. He's got it. Kenneth Branagh has it in his Henry V. Orson Welles has it in his Chimes at Midnight. It is not there in the text. It really isn't. Go back and check it out. I was watching this BBC production again. It stunned me that the major battle, right, the Battle of Shrewsbury, happens at the end of Part 1. Thinking about the Orson Welles, you think it comes towards the end. Because for Orson Welles, that battle is so significant in the British, not just in British history, but in the British mind. Wells speaks about it very beautifully, that battle was the end of Merry England. And it was the start of the modern, complex, difficult world that Britain would become. And so I've always thought about it towards the end, but actually it comes at the end of Part 1. There's a whole play to come after that. The rejection of Falstaff by Hal, I used to dream of this old man with a white beard, now I've moved on. That's the last scene of Part 2. There's nothing after that, right? So that whole scene when he goes back to Doll Tearsheet and he's very upset and he dies of a broken heart, that is taken from a soliloquy by Doll Tearsheet, by a speech by Doll Tearsheet in Henry V. But if you go back and read that speech, the whole thing of him dying of a broken heart is not there, nor is it in Henry IV Part 1 and 2. That is something that we have ascribed to Falstaff's character. But it's not necessarily true. In fact, the death scene as recounted by Doll Tearsheet is just this fond old man, a silly old fool, dying as he lived, with lots of sack, lots of, rumbustious messing around with women and having a good time. Let's look very closely at how Shakespeare sets up Falstaff's character in these two plays. In the first play, he's a different character, a subtly different character to what he is in the second play. Let me explain. In the first play, Falstaff is a fool. He drinks a lot, he sleeps a lot, he's incredibly lazy, he's a total coward. Everything he says is a lie, he's two-faced, he'll say something about someone and then when he sees them he'll say something else. And then right at the end, in the Battle of Shrewsbury, he gives that great soliloquy about honour. Like, honour? What honour? Crap, isn't it? That's for the people upstairs. What is honour? When you're dead. What does honour mean? What Falstaff he's the fool and the spokesperson of the groundlings, the working class people in the pit. He's their spokesman. Notice how he mostly speaks in prose throughout the two plays, never in verse, right? And then what's the last act of part one? He does something really horrible. We've had this very powerful moment where, Hal, the Prince of Wales, and Percy Hotspur, who has been the true figure of sympathy throughout the whole play, young, boisterous, energetic, innocent, wants to get involved. But Hal kills him, symbolically killing youth, a symbol of growing up, the killing of that wonderful, innocent energy of youth. That terrible moment when Percy says, "You killed me, you've taken my youth." It's very powerful. And what does Falstaff do? He gets in there and he says, "Right, I'll make out that I killed him." And he stabs him. He stabs his corpse. He defiles the corpse. In this version, they actually have Anthony Quayle playing Falstaff, takes him away on his shoulders. And Hal doesn't seem to react to that. A strange bit of dramaturgy from Shakespeare that I can't quite work out, actually. So he's a real horrible git. But in the second part, Shakespeare, did Shakespeare realise that Falstaff was popular with the audiences? He raises his game. He gives him a different stature. So now he's not so cowardly. He's actually quite bold with the Lord Chamberlain. He's sort of more of a lovable rogue. He's not a fool anymore. He's a rogue. He's charming with the ladies. He has a lot more comic scenes. He has a lot more asides to the audience, including that wonderful soliloquy about sack, the wonders of getting drunk, how it makes you more bolder, how it makes you more fun. So we've subtly changed from being a real arse to being a lovable rogue. And there's no sense anywhere in the play that really he's upset by Hal. So in this production, like in Orson Welles' Brilliant Chimes at Midnight, the director David Giles, who handles the drama really well throughout, I think, he does what Wells does. So in that scene, that wonderful scene, where Falstaff puts on the robe, pretends to be the king and upbraids his son, and then Hal takes his place and starts upbraiding him and just this lethal round of insults. David Giles, the director here, changes the mood, and suddenly Falstaff intuits that Hal doesn't like him. Now, as a modern audience, we think that's right, yes? And then again, when Hal rejects Falstaff at the end, and then we see that Falstaff is upset and he's broken, we respond to that. But is that there in the text? The fact of the matter is that all the way through the play, Falstaff lies about everyone, including Hal. He has no loyalties, only to himself. And at the end, when Hal rejects him, does he say he's heartbroken? No. Instead, he's still carrying on his scam of getting out of Justice Shallow loads of money. There's no sign that he's this sentimental old man. That is a modern reading. We're not seeing Falstaff as the original audience saw him. And this is how the original audience saw him. He was a figure of anarchy. He's the bad guy who doesn't care that he's bad, and he's fun and funny and lovable because he's bad. He is Punch. He's Punchinella. He's Pan. He's that anarchic figure that sometimes appears in mythology and British drama, and he doesn't care. He's just interested in wine and women and song and having a good laugh. He wants to be in a battle. He wants to get honour. The groundlings are cheering everything he says. That's the fun of him. We've lost that. We've lost the fact we're trying to psychologise him and put him into a sort of modern drama. But he's not a modern psychological creature. He's a figure of anarchy. He's the fool. He's Punch. And in this drama of fathers and sons, the loss of youth and the growth of adult responsibility and understanding, what is Falstaff but the eternal child, always playing, never taking on his responsibilities, never really understanding? He's kind of Peter Pan, isn't he? And that's why the idea that when Hal rejects him, that he suddenly comes into knowledge and consciousness of his age and who he is, doesn't really fit. Falstaff never comes into understanding. That's the whole point. That's why he counterpoints with everyone else's tragedy. If you take that away, if you make Falstaff as cognizant of his tragedy as everyone else, it changes the whole nature of his character and his relationship to everyone else in the drama. And all of this means that Falstaff is a very, very difficult role to play. People often say that, King Lear is the most difficult part in Shakespeare. No one ever quite gets it right. Falstaff is just as difficult. Because you've got to try and marry the fool of part one with the lovable rogue of part two. And you've got to try to get across this sense of an anarchic, lovable figure. And if you're going to do the modern reading, of being a surrogate father to Hal. And to do that, you need an actor who's got a tremendous presence, a power, a personality that pours off them. In this production, we've got Anthony Quayle. Anthony Quayle was a much beloved classic actor of British films, Ice Cold in Alex, all that sort of stuff. And he looks the part. He's got the red nose and he's got the big portly stance. And he's very good, he's very effective, he's very at ease on screen. And much of it he delivers brilliantly. And he doesn't quite get it right. He's just missing the mark. He's missing the mark because in that first production, he's just foolish. He's just a foolish old man. We don't get that sense of personality, that sense that draws us to him. We're not thinking about him all the time. In the second part, he grasps the comedy more and comes out of it more. But he doesn't have that sense that a Robert Stevens or an Orson Welles would have, of someone who's got an innately powerful personality that arises above, it transcends the words. It makes us see this person as an iconic figure. Quayle is just playing the part. And Falstaff is one of those parts in Shakespeare where that's not enough. The words are a launch pad for something else. Quayle doesn't quite have that. And it's a bit of a lack in this otherwise really, really good production, I think. The production is really taken away from John Finch and Anthony Quayle by two young actors. First of all, we've got David Gwilym playing Hal. I did not know anything about David Gwilym. He's not an actor I'm familiar with, and he's absolutely superb as Hal. He gets the part to a T. He gets that slight coldness of Hal, that slight calculatedness of Hal, but also the warmth of Hal and the sense of Hal watching himself become king. Just as, for example, Macbeth will watch himself become this murderous tyrant. And it's interesting, isn't it, that, Henry IV has that big speech about sleep, just as Macbeth will have a speech about sleep. But the other young actor who takes over is, of course, Tim Pigott-Smith. We've seen him as Angelo in Measure for Measure, and here he's absolutely terrific as Percy Hotspur. Now, Percy Hotspur is very important, especially if we think of Falstaff represents age, right? John Finch's Henry IV represents the responsibility of adulthood. Percy Hotspur represents the innocence of youth. It's all hot-headedness and whimsicality and wanting to do things, a bit like Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet. And Tim Pigott-Smith really grabs hold of this part, and he's wonderful in it. He gets it completely right. And all his scenes are marvellous, and he really steals all your sympathies in that part one. He steals it from all the other actors. The only time when it's ruined, actually, is that the director gets a bit excited in the Battle of Shrewsbury at the end of part one, and he fills Tim Pigott-Smith's mouth with blood. So it's that wonderful final soliloquy that he speaks is ruined because you're just watching all this sort of, I don't know whether it's tomato juice just slipping down Tim Pigott-Smith's chin. Quite ugly, really. Oh well, never mind. But his scenes are wonderful. I like the fact that this production makes a lot of the scenes with his wife, who's played by Betty. It's Betty from Some Others Do Have 'Em. Yeah, Michelle Dotrice. Frank, I'm in Henry IV Part 1, Frank. But you know what? Michelle Dotrice is wonderful. There's a wonderful scene where they're with Mortimer and his wife, who's Welsh, and she speaks in Welsh to him and sings a Welsh song, and they loll in the laps of their ladies. It's a beautiful little scene, that, very nicely staged. And also, fair play, Michelle Dotrice, it's easy to sort of patronise her because she's well known in Britain as a sort of sitcom actress, but she's excellent in this production. Her soliloquy about, praising Harry Hotspur after he's died is beautifully delivered and very, very moving, and she deserves enormous credit for it. She's very, very good in it. I just wanted to mention a few other lesser actors who could easily get missed. I wanted to mention Robert Edison. Robert Edison will be better known to you as the knight at the end of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. He's that knight who's hung around for years waiting to give someone the Holy Grail. He's quite good as Justice Shallow in this production. Gordon Gosterlow, an interesting character actor, more of a comic actor. He was from New Zealand originally, with an amazing face. He plays Bardolph. Jack Galloway is very good as Poins. Always a very scowly actor, always sort of cross-looking actor, Jack Galloway. But I think he brings in a lot more to Poins than is there in the text. He gives us a sort of psychological reading, just sort of out the corner of your eye. Clive Swift, the ever excellent Clive Swift, is a very surly, very churlish Worcester. It's quite good. But I also want to mention another very minor actor in the piece, the guy who plays the Archbishop of York, David Neal, who's got an incredible face and has got a wonderful voice and speaks the verse beautifully. And again, that scene with David Neal is very important. This is a play about the movement from youth to age, from innocence to the responsibility, but also the compromise of age, of being an adult and responsibility. That scene, that extraordinary scene, where we've had this Battle of Shrewsbury, this testing of might, this testing of youth and idealism. But then when we come to the next battle in part 2, what does the Duke of Lancaster, Hal's brother, do? He just tricks the opposition. He says, yes, we're going to have peace. And then once they believe they've dissolved all their armies, then he just locks them up. We've moved from honour and beauty and dignity to just a nasty kind of trickery, which reflects back on the trickery of Falstaff in that first battle when he just shoved his dagger in to Percy to make it look like he'd killed him. Now the whole state is doing that. The whole state is moving towards that kind of corruption and compromise. And that's one of the strange powers of this play. So I think that the modern reading, that this is about a father and it's a father and son's play, but the real father and son drama is Henry IV and his son. I think modern audiences have tried too much to see too much parallel between Hal and Falstaff, father and son. It's there, but we're missing how Falstaff also counterpoints those moments of corruption or compromise in the overarching political structure. You miss that if you just concentrate on it as a father and son drama. So it was fascinating to watch this production. It's a very good production. I really enjoyed it. There was a lot to get out of it. And it showed me the sort of political mechanics of this play, and particularly the tragedy of Henry IV. I really enjoyed it.